Somewhere on a windswept plateau in Bolivia, at an altitude where jet planes cruise and human lungs struggle to function normally, lies a pile of broken stone that has quietly humiliated modern engineers for over 100 years. Not because the stones are large, though some weigh more than a loaded semi-truck. Not because they're old, though they are. It's because of what's carved into them. Flat surfaces so precise they read as machined. Interior right angles cut with a consistency that would make a machinist nod in approval. Grooves so uniform they look extruded rather than chiseled. And officially, none of this was made with metal tools. This is Puma Punku. And after more than a century of digging, scanning, and arguing, nobody can fully explain how it was built, what it was for, or why one corner of an ancient civilization suddenly appears to have possessed tools centuries ahead of everything else it ever made. Puma Punku sits at nearly 3,850 meters above sea level on the Andean Altiplano, close to the southern shore of Lake Titicaca, the highest navigable lake in the world. This is not gentle country. Nights drop well below freezing, the growing season is brutally short, and the air holds roughly 40% less oxygen than at sea level. Physical labor here exhausts the body fast, and even standing still for long enough can bring on altitude sickness in visitors who aren't acclimatized. And yet, somehow, on this exact spot, a civilization chose to erect one of the most technically demanding stone complexes in the ancient world. When Spanish colonizers arrived in the region in the 16th century, Puma Punku was already an ancient ruin. The people living nearby had no oral history identifying who had built it. Its builders were gone, their techniques forgotten, and by the time serious archaeological survey began in the early 20th century, the site had been reduced to a scattered field of cracked, colossal blocks lying in disorder, as if some great structure had been deliberately or violently torn apart long before anyone thought to write down what it originally looked like. The people responsible for Puma Punku were almost certainly the Tiwanaku, a civilization that dominated the south-central Andes from roughly 500 to 1000 CE. Radiocarbon dating places the main construction phase at Puma Punku around the 6th century CE, squarely within the Tiwanaku's rise to regional power. And the Tiwanaku were nobody's idea of a primitive society. They engineered raised agricultural platforms called suka kolis, surrounded by water channels that moderated soil temperature and protected crops from the frost that would otherwise devastate any harvest at this altitude. This single innovation let them feed a large, centralized population in terrain that should have made large-scale farming almost impossible. They ran extensive trade networks across the Andes, built a substantial capital city, and left behind other impressive stonework, including finely carved pillars and the famous Gateway of the Sun, cut from a single monolithic slab. These were skilled, organized, technologically capable people, and that's exactly what makes Puma Punku so strange. Compare its stonework to the rest of what the Tiwanaku built, and there's a jump in precision that doesn't fit the pattern. Most Tiwanaku monuments look powerful, monumental, and clearly handworked, with the kind of texture and minor irregularity you'd expect from tools made of stone and copper. Puma Punku looks like it came out of a factory. Same civilization, same era, wildly different level of finish. Why would one construction project alone reach a level of mechanical exactness found nowhere else in that culture's body of work? That question has occupied researchers for decades, and it still doesn't have a fully satisfying answer. The material itself deepens the puzzle. Puma Punku's foundation blocks are red sandstone with some slabs weighing more than 100 tons. The largest confirmed block on site measures roughly 7.81 meters long, 5.17 meters wide, and just over a meter thick. And, based on the specific gravity of the stone, is estimated at about 131 metric tons. A second massive slab comes in, close behind, at roughly 85 tons. Both were quarried from a site near Lake Titicaca, around 10 kilometers from where they now rest. 10 kilometers doesn't sound extreme until you remember the terrain. A steep incline, thin air, and no draft animals capable of hauling that kind of weight. Everything had to move using ropes, wooden sledges, log rollers, and raw human labor. But the sandstone isn't even the hardest part of the puzzle. The finer, more elaborately carved elements at Puma Punku, including the site's signature interlocking blocks, are made of andesite, a dense, fine-grained volcanic rock. Andesite sits at roughly 6 to 7 on the Mohs hardness scale, putting it in the same range as quartz and hard enough to scratch glass. That's a serious problem for the Tiwanaku's known toolkit, since their metalworking relied heavily on copper, a soft metal that dulls quickly against rock this hard. Chipping and grinding andesite with stone hammers and sand abrasives is possible and is, in fact, the leading explanation offered by mainstream archaeology, supported by half-finished blocks found at nearby quarries that still show hammer strike depressions. But it is also punishingly slow, requiring enormous amounts of time, labor, and abrasive material to achieve the kind of crisp geometry visible at the site today. And the andesite has to travel even farther than the sandstone. Most of it is believed to originate from quarries on the Copacabana Peninsula on the far side of Lake Titicaca, roughly 90 kilometers away. Picture what that logistics chain actually required. Cutting dense volcanic rock by hand, moving it across or around the largest high-altitude lake on the planet, then hauling it up onto a freezing plateau where sustained physical EFE, Fort, saps the body within minutes. Before a single decorative groove was ever carved, the planning and manpower needed just to relocate the raw material was already an extraordinary organizational achievement. This wasn't an improvised building project. It was a coordinated large-scale logistics operation, run by people who clearly understood how to mobilize and manage labor across long distances. Modern experimental archaeology gives us some sense of what that operation might have actually looked like on the ground. Studies at other Andean and megalithic sites have shown that large labor crews, using wooden sledges dragged over prepared surfaces, wetted earth, or gravel trag, CAKS and simple log rollers, can move multi-ton stones across relatively flat terrain without any need for wheels, metal, or draft animals. The Altiplano's open, gently graded landscape would have suited this kind of approach reasonably well for much of the route, though the final approach up onto the Puma Punku plateau would have demanded earthen ramps and wooden or stone levers to inch the largest blocks into their final position. None of this required lost technology. It required discipline, planning, an enormous and well-fed workforce, and almost certainly a command structure capable of coordinating hundreds of laborers over weeks or months per stone at nearly 850 meters, where sustained physical exertion can sap human work capacity by a fifth or more compared to sea level. Simply keeping that workforce fed, warm, and organized long enough to finish the job stands as its own remarkable feat of ancient logistics, independent of anything to do with the fine carving itself. Now look closely at the finished stonework itself. Flat surfaces that run the full length of a block without dipping or warping, sharp interior corners, cut at true right angles, appearing again and again across different blocks in the same configuration. Straight-sided grooves with consistent width and depth from one end to the other. These aren't isolated flourishes. They repeat across the site with a level of standardization that suggests the builders were working from a single, deliberate design template rather than improvising each piece by eye. Cutting a clean exterior edge is one thing. Cutting a recessed 90-degree interior notch cleanly, repeatedly on multiple separate blocks is a substantially harder technical problem. And it's one of the details that keeps this site in ongoing debate. These aren't small or subtle details either. Walk the site today and you'll find dozens of these blocks in different sizes, scattered across the ground, each one showing the same combination of features. Crisp exterior edges, deep interior recesses, cut at true right angles, and surfaces polished to a consistency that catches light almost uniformly across their entire length. Archaeologists who have spent careers studying pre-Columbian stonework elsewhere in the Andes routinely describe this site as an outlier even within their own field of expertise. Not because the individual techniques are unfamiliar, but because of how consistently and how precisely those techniques were applied here compared to anywhere else they've worked. Nowhere is that debate more visible than in the H-blocks, the most recognizable and most discussed stonework at Puma Punku. Each one is carved from a single piece of andesite, and depending on the angle you view it from, reads as either an H or an I shape. Up close, they reveal fine into seal, Harnell grooves, small rectangular notches, drilled recesses, and interior faces polished to a smooth, even finish. Crucially, these blocks weren't just decorative. They were built with projecting sections designed to slot into matching recesses on neighboring blocks, functioning like components in a three-dimensional puzzle. And what's most remarkable isn't any single block's craftsmanship. It's how similar the H-blocks are to each other. These aren't unique, UE, one-off carvings. They're modular, standardized units, cut to match one another with a level of consistency that implies the builders used a master template or measuring system to reproduce the same design over and over. That kind of standardized, repeatable output resembles an early form of what we'd now call component-based construction, using interchangeable parts, thousands of years before anyone described it in those terms. After more than a century of excavation and analysis, there is still no reconstruction of Puma Punku's original layout that the archaeological community broadly agrees on. The monoliths remain fractured and scattered across the ground, and while it's clear they were meant to interlock into a coherent structure, what that structuric truly looked like standing intact is still unresolved. Three main explanations compete for that gap. One holds that a large number of components were lost, destroyed, or looted over the centuries, leaving too incomplete a record to reconstruct. Another suggests the complex itself was never finished, and that the Tiwanaku were still actively building it when their civilization began its decline. A third, favored by some independent researchers, raises the more provocative possibility that the Tiwanaku didn't carve every piece from scratch, but instead incorporate some already shaped stones they found on site into their own construction, building their city around materials that predated their arrival. It's worth being clear that this third idea remains speculative and isn't the mainstream position, but it illustrates just how unresolved the site's origin story really is. There's also a fourth, more fringe idea occasionally floated online, that the builders somehow poured a synthetic stone, a kind of ancient geopolymer, into molds, which would explain the sharp angles, the repeated shapes, and the flat surfaces. It's an interesting thought experiment, but it's rejected by the overwhelming majority of geologists who have examined the material, since Puma Punku's monoliths show the natural mineral structure and crystalline composition of genuine volcanic andesite, not a cast or poured substance. That theory gets brought up here, not because it holds up, but because it shows how far some observers are willing to reach to explain a level of precision that feels, on first glance, almost too clean for hand tools. And that reaction is understandable. When the geometry looks machine-made, imagining an invented form of concrete 1,000 years early can feel more plausible than accepting that it was done entirely by hand. But the mineral evidence simply doesn't support it. The H-blocks aren't the only sign of unusual technical skill at the site. Puma Punku also contains small, precisely bored holes that appear to have been drilled into stone far harder than anything a stone-tipped drill should easily penetrate, along with long straight-edged channels and surfaces, so smooth they resemble moh. Dern polishing rather than hand abrasion. Any one of these details could, in isolation, be explained through patient, skilled labor. But their concentration in a single location adds up to a technical package that's hard to wave away, and it's exactly the kind of accumulated evidence that keeps this site under active study, rather than filed away as solved. Toward the end of 2024, a research team brought a high-precision laser scanner onto the site, capable of measuring stone surfaces down to 1/100th of a millimeter, a resolution finer than the width of a human hair. The stated goal was to finally settle the debate by applying modern measurement tools to the most famous, and quantifying exactly how flat, how square, and how consistent the carving really is. If the resulting data holds up under peer review, it doesn't close the case at all. If anything, it sharpens the contradiction, because the surfaces measure out to a level of flatness and repeatability that is difficult to attribute to freehand grinding with stone and sand alone, even accounting for unlimited time and patience. That doesn't mean the official explanation is wrong. Experimental archaeology has shown that stone hammers, followed by grinding with sand and water on a flat, abrasive surface, can in fact produce remarkably true flat faces given enough labor hours, and unfinished blocks at nearby quarries still show exactly this kind of hammer and grind tool marks in progress. But it does mean the gap between theoretically possible and this specific level of finish, repeated across dozens of blocks, is wider than most casual explanations of the site tend to admit. It's worth pausing here to address the elephant in the room, because Puma Punku has become something of a mascot for ancient astronaut theorists and other alternative history proponents, largely thanks to television specials that leaned hard into the idea that no human civilization could have built this without outside help. Mainstream archaeologists overwhelmingly reject that framing, and for good reason. There is no physical evidence anywhere at the site of tools, materials, or techniques inconsistent with Andean Bronze Age tea technology. The copper arsenic nickel alloy found in the cramps is well within the metallurgical range the Tiwanaku are independently known to have used elsewhere. The unfinished quarry blocks show ordinary hammerstones, not something exotic. What makes Puma Punku genuinely puzzling isn't that its methods are unknown or impossible, it's that the sheer skill, standardization, and effort on display here so dramatically outpaces everything else that same culture produced. That's a real evidence-based mystery about specialization, labor organization, and lost technique. It doesn't require inventing lost technology or extraterrestrial visitors to be interesting, and treating it as a purely human achievement, just an extraordinarily impressive one, doesn't make it any less remarkable. One of the more ambitious modern attempts to make sense of the ruins didn't involve new excavation at all. It involved data. A research team compiled a century's worth of accumulated topographic surveys and used them to digitally model roughly 140 andesite components in 17 sandstone blocks from the site. They then 3D rented scaled-down versions of every piece and physically tried to fit them together, essentially solving Puma Punku like a jigsaw puzzle. The result was a genuinely interesting discovery. Fragments of doorway-like structures of different sizes, scattered across the site for a century, fit into another. A larger portal contained a smaller one nested inside it, which in turn framed an even smaller opening, producing a layered, receding visual effect carved directly into solid stone. It's an elegant possibility, and it demonstrates real ingenuity in how the pieces might once have related to each other. But it remains one hypothesis among several, not a confirmed reconstruction, and the true original form of Puma Punku still hasn't been established with certainty. Part of the reason certainty is so hard to reach is that Puma Punku wasn't just abandoned, it was actively destroyed over centuries. After the Tiwanaku civilization collapsed, the complex sat exposed and unprotected. Over time, colonial builders quarried its finely worked stone to construct churches and other buildings nearby. Treasure hunters flipped and cracked blocks searching for gold that was never there. Later, sections of the site were reportedly broken down to help stabilize the foundations of a local railway line, and dynamite blasts further fractured and displaced the remaining monoliths. Natural erosion, driven by repeated freeze-thaw cycles and relentless wind, finished the job. What's left today isn't the original monument, it's the mutilated remainder of one, which is why trying to determine its original design is less like solving a puzzle with a missing piece here and there, and more like trying to reconstruct an image when most of the pieces are simply gone, and no one recorded what the picture looked like beforehand. One detail that tends to get left out of simplified retellings of Puma Punku is arguably the strongest evidence of advanced engineering at the site: metal cramps. Numerous blocks contain small, precisely cut recesses shaped like ties or clamps, and these weren't decorative. They were designed to hold molten metal poured directly into the stone on site to physically bind separate blocks together and keep them from shifting apart during earthquakes, which are common in this seismically active region. Metallurgical analysis of surviving fragments shows these weren't pure copper. They were a deliberate alloy of copper, arsenic, and nickel, a combination that significantly increased the metal's resistance to mechanical stress compared to copper alone. Pouring molten metal directly into stone joints at nearly 4,000 meters of elevation requires controlled, high-temperature furnaces and a genuinely sophisticated portable metal casting process. This specific technique, casting metal cramps directly into architectural stonework, shows up in only a small number of ancient cultures worldwide, which makes its presence here even more significant. It tells us Puma Punku wasn't simply a stonemasonry project. It was a convergence point for the full range of technological knowledge that Tiwanaku civilization possessed: architecture, quarrying, logistics, and metallurgy, working together on a single site. It helps to place Puma Punku alongside other famously precise ancient stonework, because the comparison sharpens exactly what makes this site unusual. At Sacsayhuaman near Cusco, Inca masons fitted enormous polygonal boulders together so tightly that a knife blade can't slide between them, an achievement built through patient, iterative shaping of irregular stones to match their neighbors. At the Great Pyramid of Giza, Egyptian builders achieved extraordinary precision in overall geometry and alignment, using copper tools on softer limestone and granite, backed by a massive, well-documented state labor system. Puma Punku's puzzle is different in character from both. It isn't about fitting irregular chapes together, and it isn't about aligning a structure to the stars across a huge footprint. It's about producing small, modular, nearly identical components, cut from unusually hard volcanic rock, with repeated in turn, all right angles and consistent tolerances, by a civilization whose other stonework never approached that same standard. That specific combination, hardness of material, complexity of internal geometry, and repeatability across separate pieces, is genuinely rare in the ancient world. And it's the reason Puma Punku keeps drawing specialists back for another look, rather than settling into the textbooks as a fully resolved case. Beyond the engineering, it's worth understanding what this place actually meant to the people who built it, because Puma Punku wasn't simply an administrative or storage complex. According to Andean religious traditions, later recorded by Spanish chroniclers long after the fact, the Tiwanaku region, and Puma Punku specifically, was regarded as something close to the center of creation itself. Oral tradition held that it was here that the creator deity Viracocha brought the first humans into being from stone and shaped the constellations before sending them into the night sky. Under that belief system, every carved stone, every careful alignment, every raised terrace was part of a larger ritual language connecting the human world to the cosmic order above it. Pilgrims are believed to have traveled long distances across the Altiplano to reach this site and leave offerings, and these gatherings likely reinforced political and spiritual unity across Tiwanaku territory, turning raw stone into a shared symbol of collective identity. Puma Punku's prominence ended abruptly, around 1000 CE, leaving behind an archaeological gap that researchers are still trying to fully explain. The leading theory points to a major climate shift, a multi-decade drought that overwhelmed the region's engineered canal and field agricultural system, the very innovation that had allowed Tiwanaku's capital to feed itself in such a harsh environment. Once that system failed, famine set in, the population scattered across the Andes, and decentralized political authority collapsed, leaving these sacred monuments exposed to the elements with no one left to maintain them. When the Inca arrived in the region centuries later, they were reportedly so struck by the precision of these ruins that they wove Puma Punku directly into their own religious mythology, insisting that the structures could only have been shaped by the gods themselves. It's a telling reaction. Even a civilization known for its own extraordinary stonework looked at Puma Punku and assumed it required divine intervention to build. Modern conservation efforts have also added a new layer to the story. Bolivian authorities and international archaeological teams have worked over the past few decades to catalog surviving blocks, protect them from further looting, and slow the ongoing erosion that continues to eat away at what remains. Some of this cataloging work is XC, aptly what fed into the digital reconstruction projects mentioned earlier, since a precise, searchable record of every fragment's dimensions and carving pattern is the essential first step before anyone can meaningfully propose how the pieces once fit together. It's slow, unglamorous work, cross-referencing century-old field notes with new photogrammetry and scan data, but it's also the only realistic path toward eventually answering the questions this site keeps raising. There's no shortcut here, no single discovery likely to arrive and settle everything at once. Progress at Puma Punku comes the way progress usually comes in archaeology, incrementally, through unglamorous documentation, careful comparison, and the occasional new tool that lets researchers ask an old question with better data than before. Today, Puma Punku still resists easy explanation, and that's arguably its most important legacy. It's a reminder that human ingenuity was never limited to recent centuries, or to any single region of the world. The flawless right angles, the standardized modular blocks, the seismic-resistant metal joinery discovered on this remote Bolivian plateau all point to a level of technical mastery and architectural ambition that deserves to be taken seriously on its own terms, not dismissed simply because it doesn't match assumptions about what ancient peoples were capable of. This site remains a genuine unsolved puzzle, carved permanently into Andean stone, and it continues to push researchers to expand what they think they know and to approach the achievements of the past with real humility. The story of Puma Punku's vanished builders also invites a broader reconsideration of how human skill and ambition have developed over time. It shows, clearly and repeatedly, that technical brilliance and creative daring can emerge in some of the most extreme, most isolated environments on Earth, not despite the hardship, but sometimes because of it. Every civilization solves the specific environmental and technical problems it faces in its own way, and the disappearance of a culture does nothing to diminish the scale of what it managed to leave behind. These massive, fractured stones will likely keep drawing curiosity and admiration from people for centuries still to come. Puma Punku is proof that the past holds onto its secrets carefully, and that they only give themselves up slowly, patiently, to whoever is willing to keep asking the right questions. If a mystery like this fascinates you as much as it fascinates us, make sure you're subscribed, because we dig into stories exactly like this one every week. Drop a comment below with your own theory on how those H-blocks were actually cut. We read every single one. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, hit like and share it with someone who loves a good ancient mystery. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.